Good evening. I hope that you can hear me. Yes? Okay. My name is Anna Baczka-Zambi. I'm head of digital sociology program at Faculty of Sociology. And I have an honor to welcome all of you on our seminar, Surveillance and the Eye of God. And welcome our guest, Professor Davida Lyona. I'll say 2 words about, maybe more than 2, about the story of this event. Everything started a few months ago when Panoptykon Foundation had an idea of organizing a meeting with a professor, with some part of sociological community of our faculty. And of course, we were really excited about the idea. And soon in very fast way, we decided that the subject of surveillance is too important and too relevant to close it in classical academic seminar and only for academics. And we wanted to make it as open as it's possible, especially for the younger generation of university community. And then we couldn't organize it without this generation, so fortunately, we couldn't. Fortunately, the scientific group of digital sociology joined us and helped a lot. I hope that you will enjoy the lecture and the discussion. And I'm really, really proud that such an event can be a part of celebration of the new academic year. So now I would like to invite Katarzyna Żmilewicz, head of Panoptykon Foundation, to say a few words, and then Marianna Zieleńska will take a voice and moderate the discussion. And then finally, you will have an opportunity to hear Professor Lyona.
We will get you there. It will be sooner than you think. I want to stress that it's not us having an idea of a meeting with Professor, it's always the Professor himself who is so kind to tell us, hey, I'm coming, maybe you want to use my time when I'm there. And I just find it so amazing to have this sort of attitude towards us, small organization located somewhere in the margin of civilized world. But now maybe it feels less strange, but imagine 15 years ago when Panoptykon started and surveillance society already was a classic position in academic literature. I had my notes all over the book, you know, in the hunt for good metaphors and framing for our very, very early fight in Poland. We thought nobody understands us, and that book was a real framework for our thinking about this topic, really. And one day in 2011, so Panoptykon is 2 years old, I get this message in my inbox, a very kind message from somebody I don't know, inviting me for a coffee in Warsaw, signed Davida Lyona. And it took me a while. I was like, no, it can't be this one. But yeah, okay, I reply. It was this one. That's how our relationship started, which I hope I can call mentorship. Me obviously receiving mentorship from David. So since then, a lot of change. Back then we used Banksy as illustrations for our work. We were fighting surveillance cameras in the city. And then surveillance became more liquid, more nuanced, more friendly. We all moved to online environment where the services that sold us choice, autonomy, freedom turned out to be the real surveillance apparatus, but we desired the services. So the narratives, our fights became far more complex, far more difficult, and that was also when I referred to David on many occasions for advice. to check how I can talk about these things, what are the new battles, how can we frame them. And I'm so grateful I had this chance, and today it's my pleasure to share this privilege with you all. Have a good evening.
And finally me, I will stand, because everyone was standing. I will give just a very brief overview of David Lyon's extremely rich biography, and I will try to do at least some justice to David's work. David is a Professor Emeritus of Sociology at Queen's University, Canada. He also was appointed Professor of Law at the same university and Queen's Researcher in Surveillance Studies. He's also the founder and former long-time director of the Surveillance Studies Center, one of the key centers for research on the expanding surveillance practices. David is also the author of a number of seminal books, and I will mention just really a few. The Electronic Eye, The Rise of Surveillance Society, which is probably the most well-known and widely known book, but also Liquid Surveillance, a conversation with Zygmunt Bauman, which was also translated into Polish. And finally, one of the latest books, Pandemic Surveillance. He's also one of the founding editors of Surveillance Society and associate editor of the Information Society Journal. And for over 25 years, David has been researching the social origins, occurrence, and consequences of the increasingly widespreading processing of personal data. He shows that such surveillance processes are embedded in the everyday life of modern societies and are no longer reserved exclusively to the state. They involve private actors, they involve international actors, public-private partnerships, and so on. But today, the lecture relates to an ongoing project, a book project in which David Lyon explores the metaphor of the eye of God as a way of understanding modern surveillance and its ethical dimension, as far as I understand, which seems also to connect with his second area of studies, namely the process of secularization taking place in modernity. And before I finally give floor to David, I will just mention a few organizational issues. We will, after the lecture, we will open the floor for questions. We will have 30 to 40 minutes for questions. And I would like kindly ask those who sit at the end to come to the front if they want to ask questions because of the technical reasons. Okay, I think that's enough of my talking. Now, please, David, your time.
Now, I'm aware that many Polish churches include an eye of God or an eye of providence image. When I went to the Old City, I was looking for this symbol, and there is one, and it's out in the open. It's not in a church. In fact, I don't know what it's there for, but anyway, it's in Piwna, number 19, and right in that little street, it's one of the narrow streets, there is an eye of God in a triangle carved in stone. I asked some people in other stores around it, because it's lots of tourist stores, but nobody knew what the eye of God meant in that context. The image is a reminder of God. Obviously, the eye is there in the center, and it's a triangle suggesting Trinity or Trinitarian understandings of God. And of course, the eye is watching. And today, this is why it's interesting to me, the eye seems to be receiving new attention within the surveillance studies community. And that surveillance studies community is not only about surveillance as a surveillance society, it was one of the titles that was mentioned in the introduction, but also a surveillance culture. There's another book on the culture of surveillance that I think was 2015. And in that, I try to show how what is particularly significant about today's surveillance is that we are all involved. It is not merely something that is kind of done to us from outside. It is our participation that enables the surveillance today. And that's why I wrote about the culture of surveillance, because we participate in our own surveillance, knowledgeably or without knowing. But either way, we are still participating. Now, the common metaphors that you will be well aware of are Panoptykon on the one hand and Big Brother on the other. And of course, they have a lot to offer the debate. When I was making that little book way back in the 1980s, it eventually came out in 94, I realized that a lot of sociologists and people in related disciplines who were writing about surveillance were actually starting not with some sociological writer, but with George Orwell in 1984. And a lot of the kind of theoretical ideas were coming out of Orwell's work, which I found a very interesting phenomenon. So I want to focus on this other metaphor. I'll say a little bit about Panoptykon and Big Brother, but the eye of God has also been a metaphor for surveillance for a long time. And so it's commonly invoked by critiques of surveillance, negative critiques of surveillance, but less explicitly explored in surveillance studies. In popular use, it speaks of unseen but threateningly powerful forces of hierarchical and hegemonic power. Ironically, however, as I've started researching this idea, I'm discovering that its ancient forms stress a surveillance that is caring, emancipatory, and empathetic to those in its gaze, while being explicit, like transparent, and accountable to appropriate authority. Indeed, they seem, in their ancient form, to be close to some current concerns, and that's why I'm exploring the idea. Okay, so now I'll start with a story. James McLeod is a Canadian citizen. He lives in Ottawa, in Canada. And each morning on his way to work, now I never checked how we were going to change the slides, but we're ready for a change. I'll just tell you and change it. On his way to work, he picks up a coffee and bagel at Tim Hortons, which is a fast food coffee outlet. Do you have Tim Hortons in Poland? Well, you're not missing much. He uses his mobile ordering app in order to pick up his breakfast. then he can know that they know what he wants as he drives up to the door, and all he has to do is pick it up. However, the app, downloaded for his convenience, so he is told, allows the company, well, the company that owns Tim Hortons, to follow him everywhere, even when he is not using it. And even though he was told by the small print that it would not be on when it was off. When he allowed the app to connect with the GPS, the Global Positioning Satellite, he consented to this, or that's what the company told him. A phone ping that came rather too often in his phone alerted him and aroused his suspicion that more seemed to be going on than he had signed up for. So, being a thoughtful person, he decided he would make a Freedom of Information request in order to find out how much more the machine knew about him. Well, it turned out that his home address and his work location and his vacation plans were all known by the app. Also, his girlfriend's address. When he attended a Blue Jays baseball game in Toronto, and the phone also tracked his trip through Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam when he took a flight to Morocco that laid over in Amsterdam. And while in Morocco, his app also noted that he was near to a Kentucky Fried Chicken outlet near the train station in Marrakesh. Because the owner of Tim Hortons, of course, wants to know when he is not at Tim Hortons and rather at some competitor. Indeed, some event, as they call it, was recorded every single time that he was more than 100 meters from the door of his own apartment. Now, it's this kind of tracking through everyday life that prompts talk of the eye of God. The eye is invisible. He had no idea that he was being watched in such a way. It seems to be everywhere, and he was surprised that it traced him to Morocco and not just to the local Tim Hortons where he picked up his coffee and bagel. And yet, how it works and the nature of the power behind it is entirely unclear, certainly unclear to James MacLeod. In his description of Tim Tracker Hortons, James MacLeod makes no reference to those who might explain and theorize his experiences. His point, it seems to me, in the little article that he wrote for the newspaper, is just to warn others of the apparently innocent, but in fact insidious, as far as he saw it, ways that personal details are plied around the planet with perturbing personal consequences that he cannot pin down. Well, it's a long read, but Shoshana Zuboff's book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, next slide, you got it, thank you. She could have told him exactly what is going on as far as she understands it. Clearly, this is not Big Brother, whose reference is the totalitarian state, as you all know, and equally not exactly the Panoptykon either, where originally prison inmates are inspected in the apparent absence of the inspector. And the name of Michel Foucault, the well-known Panoptykon theorist, doesn't actually appear in Shoshana Zuboff's book. Now, Zuboff, if asked, would explain to MacLeod that his unease stems from the presence of what she calls instrumentarianism, an updated and inflated version of B.F. Skinner's very 20th century Walden 2, thought of by him as a utopia, a highly desirable condition, but by Zuboff as an avoidable dystopia based on behaviorism. Instrumentarianism, I don't know why she chose that word, but anyway, instrumentarianism captures human behavior as data in order to modify, predict, monetize, and eventually control it. We, the daily dupes of this new order, are transformed into the means to others' ends, as the machines of surveillance capitalism do their work. And this is, for Zuboff, how the eye of God becomes a vital metaphor. She uses it, and uses it a lot. Why? Well, because a key player at Google, Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Arthur Pentland, sees Walden 2, the B.F. Skinner utopia or dystopia, as the pre-electronic model for a potential dream of programmed society, his potential dream of a programmed society. I find it really curious that Shoshana Zuboff at Harvard is just down the road from this character, Alexander Pentland, and she's writing a fierce critique of this guy who she might meet in a coffee shop, for that matter. Anyway, and Pentland calls his the God's eye view. He's looking at it favorably as a God's eye view. And thinking positively of this eye as he does, Pentland engaged in what he called reality mining in his social physics lab at MIT, using cell phones and wearables that were already circulating by 2005, which is the year that Zuboff has in mind when she's writing about his work. And Pentland is the character who was behind Google Glass, which rose to some sort of fame and has currently disappeared, and I think is now discontinued by Google. Do you remember the thing? It had a funny little wraparound wire section, and in one corner on one side were all the little electronic works behind a little plastic case. Anyway, Pentland also experimented with speech recognition, and he did so for profiling people based on the words that they use. So, did James MacLeod imagine that his Tim Hortons mobile ordering app was associated with such a history? Or that its implications for his life and others were so much more problematic than he imagined? As he saw it, he thought his problem was his personal privacy. He was niggled by the uncomfortable feeling that unknown others knew of his movements, his relationships, his daily activities. And such things can be very disturbing, of course, for all sorts of reasons. But that he might somehow be disadvantaged or influenced or marginalized by the ways that the data were used, or that a much more profound social, economic, and political shift towards technocracy or a technocratic form of organization might be occurring, rather than just his own uncomfortable experiences, was not hinted at in his newspaper article. So, I hope you're with me so far. I want to do a little bit of comparison of the metaphors first, and then we'll move on to more analysis. To someone who's very interested in not only analyzing the astonishing expansion of 21st century surveillance. Remember, I started looking at this stuff in 1983. It's now 2023. It's a long time that I've been thinking about this stuff. But it's also how it's understood in an everyday sense within cultures of surveillance that are important to me. And that's also why it's important to explore the metaphors and the memes and so on that surround surveillance today. My phone's listening to me is a common comment, but it reveals more about the speaker of that comment than about the surveillance. Yet phrases like this are part of a rather well-known and increasingly well-known culture of surveillance that differs in detail from place to place, of course. The surveillance cultures here in Poland are not going to be the same ones as in Canada or as in Afghanistan or in Brazil, for that matter. But although they differ from place to place, they're always present within each contemporary surveillance culture, because surveillance has come to be recognized by so many as an everyday experience rather than a specialized experience that is targeted to particular people and organized by a specific entity that is usually nameable. Increasingly, we have all become conscious of the surveillance that surrounds us and in which we willingly or otherwise participate. Talking of memes, I'll turn to Big Brother. That's that cue for the PowerPoint again. Probably the best known symbol of surveillance, certainly in the Western world. The image, not this image, but the image from George Orwell's gripping novel about totalitarian life in Oceania, a society ruled by fear under the dictatorial Big Brother. Constant surveillance using what now seem like quaint technologies of a two-way telescreen ensures that the citizens never know when their activities and conversations will be betrayed, or quite what the consequences of that betrayal might be. Now, sociologists might say that Orwell's is a kind of Weberian approach in which the growth of modern bureaucracy, especially in the workplace, entails increasingly close scrutiny of daily activities by management in order to achieve greater efficiency. At the same time, bureaucratic pressures within governing bodies encourage greater surveillance in every realm, especially today as geographical mobility increases, raising challenges, for example, to older, more lax national borders. But what is the basic message of Orwell's novel? In the end, is it merely a disturbing dystopia, or in fact a clarion call to defiant deeds. I tend to agree with Peter Marx's view. The novel's power lies in its capacity not to show just a harrowing world of total surveillance, but to show the gaps and spaces where Big Brother does not or cannot watch you. It's a quote from Marx's book. For Zuboff, however, Orwell's work is exemplary for its resistance to what others may shrug off as inevitable trends. Today, many more speak the language of inevitability, or if they don't speak it, they kind of assume it when it comes to surveillance, often encouraged by the very media that perpetuates it. On the other hand, some see today's surveillance society as in some ways worse than Orwell's dystopia. Perhaps because the pressure to conform is more readily accepted, if not welcomed. See, for example, Bernard Harcourt's book, which is called Exposed: Desire and Disobedience in a Digital Age. I think it's a really good treatment, and that's written by someone who actually is a lawyer, not someone who just pretends to be a lawyer because the Faculty of Law invited him to be a professor in that faculty. He's a real lawyer and a very good writer. In 2019, the New York Times published a piece in their rather long series on privacy. And this particular piece within the series was called "When Big Brother Isn't Scary Enough." And he cited medieval historian Benjamin Saltzman's claim that today's surveillance society represents the Middle Ages, in which people had to operate, quote, in a society structured around a mysterious, all-seeing force. And we'll turn to that in just a moment. But I just want to say a couple of things about the Panoptykon, for which there's another image. Jeremy Bentham's precious prison plan from the 1790s. It is an important shift an important marker of a shift from an older regime of power rooted in medieval times to modern, Enlightenment-influenced ideas of punishment and control. Bentham, cynically as I see it, included a pointed biblical quote on his plan, taken from Psalm 139, which goes like this: "Thou art above my path and above my head. Thou spiest out all my ways," end quote. However, what the plan itself showed was not that God was really in his mind, but that he wanted to show how such a deity could be demoted in favor of an architectural alternative. Incidentally, perhaps, it also indicated a new role for prisons. Bentham was a kind of neoliberal before the term, because it indicated a new role for prisons as potential for-profit businesses, because Bentham intended to make money out of the new comprehensive vision facilitating architecture. In fact, it's clear from his writing that he wanted to be the first inspector of the first ever Panoptykon. The Panoptykon might have slipped into obscurity, however, as just another historical invention that hadn't worked out. The prison, according to Bentham's plan, or precisely according to Bentham's plan, was never built, although its influence did stretch, actually, around the world. in Canada, I've been living in Kingston, Ontario for 30-something years, and Kingston has a penitentiary dating from 1832. By 1832, the Panoptykon plan of Bentham from 1793 had had time to move by the forms of transport then available to the so-called New World, which was an old world to the folks who were already living there. It was the colonial adventurers who thought of it as a new world. Anyway, the Panoptykon prison in Kingston, where I live, is not exactly on the plan, but it's heavily influenced by it. And another day when I was, I didn't really mean to be in Bogota. I'd been turned back from an invitation. I'd been turned back at an airport, an invitation that had been given to Brazil, and the previous airport that I'd come from was Bogota, so they sent me back on the plane to Bogota, but it meant that I discovered in Bogota El Panoptico, the National Museum of Colombia, is in the Panoptykon prison, refurbished as a museum. So the Panoptykon actually did travel quite well around the world. Bentham probably wasn't aware of how far his idea went. I must stick to the story that is in my text, because otherwise I will keep talking for too long. Okay. It was Michel Foucault that made Bentham's work on the Panoptykon so significant, parading it as a key to understanding modern power. He saw the Panoptykon as moving away from brutal physical punishment to an intensified form of discipline, albeit with a less evident inspector. But inmates were subject not only to a new kind of discipline, but also, in the Panoptykon, to classification, depending on what kind of crime they had committed, and differential treatment intended to render them more governable. As a leading motif in his theory of surveillance and discipline, Foucault placed the Panoptykon at the center of his argument that populations were now implicated in their own self-government, their own self-management. They must assume that they specifically may be under scrutiny, generating data from their visibility, as it were. And not only in prison, plague management was enhanced by panoptic checking on citizen movements and contacts, as was workplace control, as in his brother Samuel's experience in Russia, which is where he got the idea from in the first place for the prisons, increasing governability or governmentality. Okay, so much for the Panoptykon. The third motif then that I want to speak about, and the one that I want to spend most time on, is the eye of God. Easily the oldest notion, you can change it, affecting the public understanding of watching and visibility. The other two, remember, are distinctly modern, and in each case they are marked by some of the signs of modernity. Eye of God, not so. The eye of God was, of course, already present in Bentham's scheme, a secular reference to commonly understood medieval notions of reliance on divine vision for maintaining social order, sometimes known as Christ Pantocrator. The word is Greek for all-powerful. The metaphor does have some creepy connotations, and this usage has persisted metaphorically into the present, often with reference to the latest and often the most potentially threatening forms of surveillance in the 21st century. which is why Shoshana Zuboff uses it in her book on the Age of Surveillance Capitalism. So the eye of God still seems to be popular today, resonating with the distant, detached view, as Professor Pentland at MIT called it, which was picked up by Zuboff in her criticism of him. It's matched by other authors. I mentioned one whose work I like a lot, Kate Crawford, in her book, Atlas of AI. And she says, quote, "The AI industry is making and normalizing its own proprietary maps as a centralized God's eye view of human movement, communication, and labor. The metaphor finds its way into both everyday conversation and high-level military, security, and policing language, especially when camera systems are involved. The meaning is assumed to be powerful, all-seeing, remote, and often invisible to those in its view." So there's little doubt about the kinds of meanings associated with the texts that I have mentioned that speak of the eye of God. It seems to be intrusive, inscrutable, invincible, and a negative feature of the digital landscape for these contemporary authors, though possibly justified in some cases, I've found, by the felt need for security or social order. To those who worry, it is a looming threat, especially to the vulnerable, and something whose scope is constantly expanding. The eye seems to be able to take in more and more. And the eye of God is not to be trifled with. You should take it very seriously in this new version, as it dramatically generates fears of external control, not just of a big brother, but also of a black mirror kind. As the harbinger of a surveillance society, the eye of God is seldom welcomed. But what about in earlier societies than ours today? And that's what I want to move into speaking about now. The eye of God metaphor has deep roots in an understatement. Let's begin with the medieval European roots of this phenomenon. Some will agree with the common assumption expressed by Astrid Schmidt-Burckhardt that despite the emphasis in some theorists' work that the eye is the key organ of socialization in human beings, you in sociology may know of Georg Simmel's work on this, and that such mutual vision is essential to the civilizing process. Norbert Elias writes about that. The privilege of free vision, however, is connected with hierarchical authority. So, Astrid Schmidt-Burckhardt adduces, quote, "The overpowering and ubiquitous eye of God can be considered as a prototype of this hegemonic vision." As you'll see, I'm not going to agree with her by the time I've finished trying to get more from this metaphor. Now, the eye of God doesn't seem to appear very much in really ancient art. And one of the earliest illustrations is, in fact, in medieval times, perhaps from 1480 or so. It's Hieronymus Bosch's 7 Deadly Sins, for which there's also a slide. For sure, the warning element is present in this painting. Cave, cave, dominus videt, except the min is left out. It's reduced to dos videt. But its meaning is clear. Beware, beware, God is watching, or God sees. Eye, sun, and light in the painting expose these sins, while the Christ figure at the center watches widely from that central vantage point, missing nothing of the everyday life world. However, the image of Jesus at the center of that portrait is in relation to the crucifixion and thus to hope of redemption. But despite this, Schmidt-Burkholder concludes that the devout were supposed to internalize the divine gaze as normalized surveillance. Well, perhaps she's right, but what does she mean? Well, and this is what has become interesting to me now that I am reading, for the first time in my life, medieval historians' work. Benjamin Saltzman, who's a medieval historian at the University of Chicago, has examined the ways in which God's omniscience, God's all-knowing, based on God's all-seeing, was basic to how society worked between the years of 600 and 1100 in particular. He examines medieval legal systems on the one hand and daily life in the monastery on the other. And he has some wonderful textual data to be working with. The belief in God's omniscience, based on this all-seeing character, he concludes was in tension with the social experience of privacy. And he puts it this way: God knew all human secrets, and yet God's secrets remained fundamentally unknowable to human beings. Saltzman also comments on the general thesis of his book, and he says this: in the Middle Ages, God's omniscience disciplined people through a peculiar combination of fear and a belief in the benevolence of the divine. Medieval Christians believed that God was essentially good, but feared God greatly. This was why early medieval legal institutions could rely on God as a reliable witness. Let me just give you one illustration. In many societies still today, if you are in a court of law, you might be invited to place your hands on a Bible as a guarantee that what you're saying is the truth. Now that's one of the relics, as it were, one of the things that's left over from that medieval practice of basing legal arguments on the idea that God is watching. And so that persists to the present day. There's another medieval historian that I'm reading. She's called Amanda Power, and she is at Oxford University in England. And she has an equally subtle analysis of feudal surveillance that, like the other character I mentioned, Saltzman, she also compares with the present. And that's the interesting thing that I'm finding, that medieval historians doing their work are suddenly saying, isn't this a bit like the present day? And then publishing something that comments on how what they're studying in medieval times relates to the present as they understand it. And she concludes, Amanda Power concludes, that today's smartphone users and online addicts, as she calls them, seem to be peculiarly content to be surveilled by unknown figures. And she detects a parallel experience in today's surveillance world with the medieval reassurance and warning that we are watched. Today, she speculates, quote, we cannot conceive of how what we reveal now about ourselves and our children may be used in the future And yet, the deep narratives of our culture, she's referring to the medieval times that she studies, tell us that the lost happiness of humanity consists of living naked and innocent within the absolute love of an omniscient watcher. What do you make of that? I'm still trying to work it out. Of course, Schmidt, Burckhardt, and others also acknowledge the secularization of the eye of God as it shifted to another plane during the Enlightenment. It became the highly recognizable emblem of reason and also of political revolution in both France and America in particular. The eye of providence, still exuding its religious overtones, but now in a more political context, became an integral part of the Great Seal of the United States in 1782. Yes, there's another image for that. It epitomized the Novus Ordo Seclorum, which is the heading, which was also eventually to adorn the back of the US dollar bill. In France, the image of the eye of God was more deliberately secularized, along with its secular rituals and images, such as the all-seeing eye in a triangle. And the ways that the secularized eye of God was used undoubtedly related to a notion of superior power with which citizens and others had to comply. Added to which, the idea that the eye was benign and relational probably diminished within that secular frame. It's one of my research questions. What we do know is that it was a short step not only to the diversification of images of the eye, but also to, by the 19th century, its mechanization, the mechanization of the eye, which was very important for surveillance. New instruments such as the camera added to vision and over time offered opportunities both for its powerful position when used by authorities and eventually for its popular appropriation. Josh Lauer is, to my mind, one of the best historians of surveillance, and his treatment of the history of the camera and associated technologies is totally fascinating to anyone who's interested in surveillance today. In the 21st century, of course, almost everyone carries their own electronic eye within their smartphone. And that electronic eye is sometimes used to contest surveillance power and not just add to it. I discussed that in the Culture of Surveillance book. Today, surveillance history has shifted again from an almost exclusive focus on the eye. Think about it, detective stories and Shakespeare, for that matter, frequently referred to the eye as the surveillance medium, not just, the ear, not just the eye as the medium of surveillance. Surveillance is a kind of catch-all word that includes all sorts of human organs and mechanical and now electronic devices within its eye-based or its optical origins. Yet surveillance is still symbolized for many by publicly placed cameras. As someone who has been the author of a number of surveillance books, I can tell you it is very difficult to persuade a publisher to put a smartphone on the cover of the book about surveillance when all they want to put on the cover is a pole-mounted camera. Yeah, anyway, that's just a problem for authors, I think. Today, other ways of seeing populations have emerged, through information gathering in the 20th century, and now data analysis using algorithms and AI in the 21st. Which returned us to the question of surveillance capitalism and platform companies. Not to mention tech solutionism, Evgeny Mozorov's term, where government appears to agree with corporations and technology, that technology holds the key to progress by addressing social issues with new technologies, and what Jose van Dyke talks about as data-ism. I'm not talking about Harari's version, I'm talking about Van Dyke's version of data-ism. And for her, the idea of data-ism is on the one hand a belief in objective quantification and tracking, and on the other hand, trust in the agents that collect, interpret, and share metadata. Thus, the eye of God has a long and fascinating history that has become central to my current research project. The plot line has altered over time, as well as varying by context and country. One cannot take its meaning as obvious or fixed. However, one question arising from these factors, a bit like the question that I was asking a few minutes ago about Orwell's work, is this: are we looking at hierarchical hegemony, which is Astrid Schmidt-Burkholtz's notion, or are we looking at humanized hope? And to answer this, we turn not to artistic depictions this time, but to texts. As Schmidt-Burkhardt herself notes, the eye or eyes of God are often mentioned in the Bible, which is where I'm going to turn. However, I should tell you, I am not an expert in Hebrew, Greek, or textual interpretation, so I'm learning from others' work as I pursue these studies. Thankfully, I have found some enthusiastic helpers. My Hebrew teacher is very keen to get me to actually put pen to paper and write up this book. So let me talk a little bit about recovering ancient texts. What happens if you dig deeper into scriptural texts that lay behind the medieval worldview and practical socio-political arrangements? Texts which, of course, were only open to an educated few because the times were vastly less literate. Rather than launching into a comprehensive inventory that would take at least one book in itself, I'm going to use just 3 examples that arguably exemplify some biblical themes. They're historical rather than poetic. In other words, I'm using historical sections rather than poetic ones from the Bible. And although the eye is very much there in poetic as well as in the historical sections. And of course they are also Christian reference, rather than looking more broadly at, say, the Eye of Horus in ancient Egypt, or the Ojo de Dios in both indigenous and Latin America. There are plenty of eyes of God in other cultures, and in what I eventually do, while showing what the medieval worldview gave to surveillance studies, I'm going to acknowledge and say a little bit more about those other images as well. My first example is that of Hagar and the compassionate eye. Although Amanda Power pointedly observes that the medieval eye of God is consistently male, this case centers on a woman, although the gaze is still God's. Hagar was the Egyptian maidservant of Sarai, the wife of Hebrew patriarch Abraham. The Hebrew God, Yahweh, had promised that they'd have many descendants, but frustratingly, Sarai seemed barren. Having agreed that Hagar could bear a child for her, which was legally possible at the time, Sarai becomes understandably jealous. And her deteriorating relationship with Hagar ends with Hagar's expulsion from the home. And she heads for the desert, presumably to die. But in her despairing plight, Hagar meets a figure who appears as a divine messenger, offering her advice and reassurance that her son will parent a great people. And here's the important thing. In response to that, what we might describe as an intersectionally vulnerable foreign, she's Egyptian, female, no rights, fugitive, she'd run away from her slave owner, strikingly names the God who sees me, El Roi. From the same Hebrew root comes shepherd, the one who watches over or watches out for the sheep. And here the motif of care is dominant, suggestive of the contemporary ethic of care proposed in feminist theory as antidotes for data-obsessed modes of surveillance. Hagar, you'll be interested to learn, is the only woman in the Bible who names God, an extremely significant act, something confirmed by Janet Soltis in a new book that comes out just this year. The people who acknowledge her as their believing mother are the Adnani Arabs. Muslims recall Hagar in their Hajj to Mecca. Second example, Moses and what I'm calling the emancipatory eye. It's when Moses is made aware that God has seen the misery of the Hebrew slaves in Egypt under Pharaoh that he's called to take action. The Hebrew word for seen, ra, is from the same family as Roy, indicating the shepherd's gaze. And after a protracted and punishing tussle with the Pharaoh, a troubled transaction occurs in which the slaves are freed in the Exodus narrative. And this became not only the founding event for the Jewish people, but also a symbol of justice in the freeing of slaves from bondage in many other contexts as well, right down to black emancipation in the US. The divine purpose in perceiving the plight of those Hebrews was acting to end injustice on the one hand, and to bring them to freedom as the people of God on the other. Moses was God's chosen champion. And in the 20th century, Exodus became an energizing motif of so-called liberation theology, especially in Latin America, where centuries of damaging and denigrating colonialism had both reduced indigenous peoples to strangers in their own land and their economies to adjuncts of rich capitalist ones, particularly in the USA. In a surveillance context, theologian Eric Stoddart, there is one theologian of surveillance around, if you hadn't come across him, he argues that Guterres' liberation theology seeks not only justice, but justice as the common good. And in this context, he proposes that the common good should embrace, using a wordplay on Guterres, who spoke of God's preferential option for the poor. I'm afraid there was a Polish archbishop who really didn't like the work of Guterres, but without apology, I'll continue. He used the wordplay to describe God's preferential optic for those who are digitally poor. Then my third example is of Jesus himself. I said I'd talk about Jesus, and here it is. The empathetic eye. Once again, curiously, the shepherd's gaze in watching over the sheep is prominent in Jesus' teaching. Jesus' local language is Aramaic, though the written Gospels are in Greek. This is evident not least in his self-naming as the Good Shepherd, who not only watches over, but also lays down his life for the sheep. So why is Jesus portrayed in this fashion? Because Jesus, it is claimed, leads the way into a good life, in which God's intentions for humanity can be sought and experienced. Seeking the common good is of the essence for Stoddard, and this may also act as a template for appropriate surveillance. There are other texts, of course, other examples that we could use. I could look at some of the texts about the open and accountable eye of the watcher from an analysis of the biblical figure of the watchman in both historical and poetic contexts, and in both Old and New Testaments. This offers perspectives on the urgent contemporary questions of the responsibility and accountability of surveillance itself, crucial for thinking about the limits on surveillance. But my research has not gone that far yet, not there. Let me say just one more thing about Jesus and surveillance. Of course, as Bosch's Seven Deadly Sin pictures, the central eye is that of the man of sorrows, Jesus. Among other things, Jesus himself is subjective to intense surveillance by both the religious establishment that he criticized and the ruling Roman colonial occupying powers. Yet at the crucifixion, the local Roman king, Herod Antipas, insists that this condemned prisoner be named the King of the Jews. Thus, this sovereign may have been the all-powerful, Pantocrator, the word I used before, Jesus of the paintings, but paradoxically also the abject, crucified God, as theologian Jürgen Moltmann calls him. In other words, his regal surveillance is from a posture of utter vulnerability, and thus, suggests Stoddard, in solidarity with those whose suffering, suffering surveillance of very negative, inhumanly vindictive kinds. So what can we say, finally, about how this research might help us think about the character of surveillance? Because you see, what we've done is to move from seeing the eye of God as an entirely negative way of thinking about surveillance, to discovering that in the ancient texts, and somewhat reflected in the medieval experience, there are very positive ways of thinking about surveillance, which could be used as ways of arguing for kinds of surveillance that meet human-centered priorities and not those who are engaged in one form of power or another. So what do we say then about the eye of God against technocratic surveillance capitalism? Surveillance capitalism, the current epitome of technocracy, is dangerous for democracy, as Zuboff observes. It's also high risk for many ordinary consumers and citizens in everyday life. Zuboff's work leans towards the critique of unfreedom. Mine tends to lead towards the critique of unfairness, but each is a significant feature of surveillance capitalism and its collusion between platform companies and government departments. The last research project that I oversaw before I retired is one whose report was published as Beyond Big Data Surveillance, freedom and fairness. You can find it online if you want to look at it yourself. It came out of a really interesting project that we did from 2015 to 2021, and it came out last year. Beyond big data surveillance. These are major themes of today's surveillance, and it seems to me that the striking images that we've just been considering place them in a very poor light. When will we see surveillance conducted for the common good and by those who align themselves with those who suffer negative surveillance? I'll run quickly through one or two of these and then wrap up. One area today, as you are all too well aware here in this country, is the conduct of democratic elections. Around the world, elections are threatened and frequently actively compromised by the activities of social media and other platform companies. Some of the most egregious effects of surveillance capitalism are in the realm of democratic elections, seen in Cambridge Analytica Facebook scandal in 2018, the full story of which we may never know. Other examples of similar things are manifold, and it's a critical area for our consideration, the role of surveillance in contemporary elections. I'll just say a little bit about the compassionate eyes and the other two eyes that I mentioned a moment ago. Compassionate eyes, well, other work that's being done in this area includes, for example, and I think prominently, the work of Lynette Taylor, whose work is primarily on surveillance in global south countries, and she is in the pursuit of data justice. And her work I find very helpful here. But also Joy Bolamwini, a computer scientist, demonstrates how specific tools of biometrics and facial recognition are frequently biased against black people, women, and people with disabilities. Her new book is just about to come out, called Unmasking AI, My Mission to Protect What is Human in a World of Machines. She is wanting to be human-centric rather than technocentric in her work. She actually founded the Algorithmic Justice League in the US, which I think is another fine NGO, another fine one, as well as Panoptykon, I mean. So yeah, emancipatory eyes. Well, there are lots of ways in which we could think about this. One example that occurs to me is the plight of Palestinians in contemporary Israel in the basically settler colonialism that characterizes that country now. An awful lot of interesting work has been done by a number of people, actually most of them in Israeli universities, looking at the way in which surveillance is used against Palestinians as one means of maintaining their subjugation in that country. What about the empathetic eye? Well, this was the empathetic eye, the eye of Jesus, the crucified God. A good example of the sort of thing that we could be thinking about here is what you may not have come across in Polish newspapers. It's the robo-debt crisis in Australia. The robo-debt scandal was basically this. There was a welfare system, highly automated, that was developed quite a number of years ago now, and it was intended to indicate to whom overpayments were being made within the welfare system. The algorithms, it was found by a royal commission into robo-debt, the algorithms were systematically biased against the most vulnerable people who were involved as those who were indicated who needed welfare within that robo-debt system. And the report from the Royal Commission is a really interesting and damning indictment of a system that showed no empathy whatsoever with those with whom it had to do. So the idea of the empathetic eye, I see totally missing from that robo-debt situation. And obvious corollary would be to say, well, how about designing a system that has very, very different kinds of algorithms built into it? Lots more that we could say here, and lots more that I was planning to say. So what I'm asking at the end of the day is for us to consider radically different mandates for surveillance today. We're not actually going to get away from a world that involves surveillance, not least because surveillance has many positive and helpful aspects in the world in which we live. But these should be ones that begin with the human and the issues that relate to a human world, that would lead to the promotion of human flourishing before the current aims which have to do with profit and control within surveillance capitalism. It's completely different from the way that things are currently organized, but it isn't impossible to hope for. Indeed, we strongly need a sense of exactly what to hope for, which in a sense is what the eye of God is all about. Priority for the most vulnerable, seeking emancipatory and equitable solutions within the world of digital systems, things that encourage the common good with a common gaze. These concerns were central to the eye of God in its pre-secular form. And while the eye of God in many secularized contexts is indeed hierarchical and hegemonic, easily expressed in surveillance capitalism, it does not have to be this way. The future is not foreclosed, although at present, admittedly, the task of forging alternatives to surveillance capitalism is not going to be easy. But I would argue that it is worth the effort for a world that is both free and fair, and above all, human. Thank you. Ways in which algorithmic organization has to be restructured. One of my former PhD students has done some very interesting work on medical diagnostic apps to go on your phone. So a doctor is using an app to aid in the diagnosis and to be able to reduce the number of possibilities of the conditions experienced by the person in front of them. And what my former student showed very clearly was that a lot of those diagnostic apps are basically racist, not to put too fine a point on it. That is to say, the data in them is based on material from medical journals that was already biased in terms of racial backgrounds of potential patients of doctors who are looking for diagnosis. So there's interesting work going on in that field too, and I think that in surveillance studies we should be commending those items, even though they might be few and far between, that show some indication of moving things towards more human-based priorities than profit and control ones. And that really begins to answer the question, the third question about whole populations. Certainly, whole populations are involved in a number of government surveillance systems, but there again, questions can be asked at any point. We are not mute citizens in the countries in which we live. And Canadian example again, talk about surveillance capitalism. During the pandemic, the Public Health Agency of Canada bought mobile data from one of our providers, and 33 million Canadian records were, for some reason, being used by the Public Health Agency of Canada during the pandemic. You've probably read Naomi Klein's work on shock doctrine, and it seems to me that examples like that are so obvious. The pandemic was a key moment for many, many companies and governments using algorithmic surveillance for some purpose or another to jump on the pandemic bandwagon and to use it as an excuse for, well, changing the law in some cases, ignoring the law in others. It does seem to me that it is crucially important for us working in surveillance studies to be working with those who are attempting to regulate where regulation is still possible, and those possibilities are currently being whittled down by surveillance capitalist tendencies, but nonetheless the possibilities are still there. And questions were certainly raised in Canada about the buying of mobile data by public health, supposedly to try to trace faster the root of the virus. But anyway, it seems to me there are plenty of opportunities, and it is incumbent on us, not merely as students of surveillance studies, but just as citizens within surveillance-dominated societies, to be attempting to make a difference.
We should be wrapping up slowly, but we still have time for one last question. Is there a question someone would like to ask, and or maybe engage in further discussion? Or is everyone satisfied with answers? Then I will say just very shortly that I think it's quite courageous and also difficult to engage in discussion and try to look for, let's say, more look for hope in surveillance, because we all are quite used to feeling quite doomed. And my last question would be, how could we engage more systematically in, let's say, to make sure that some sort of human flourishing has even a chance? Because you were mostly referring to quite fragmented initiatives. But what we would be looking for is something that gives us hope for some kind of more systematic control from the side of citizens. Yeah, that would be my question and comment in one.
Well, it's a great question. And I think that one area that is critically important is, as I say, we live in a world where there are rapidly developing and rapidly morphing cultures of surveillance. Contributing to those, I think, at a grassroots level is a really good way forward. Obviously, you've heard me say that I very much admire the work of NGOs in the area. I admire the work of professional organizations in computing and related disciplines, building of algorithms and so on and so forth, where there are also people working at a very critical point within what I've been discussing. And they are also doing really good work. Some of the older organizations to do with computing and computing sciences are really at the forefront of thinking about alternatives that are appropriate. So the IEEE, and a number of national and international computing organizations are looking at exactly these kinds of questions and are working hard to try to make a difference. So I think those kinds of things, the NGOs on the kind of regulation and legal level, the computer scientists and related disciplines working on they tend to think of them as the ethical questions. That's also crucial. But there's also the obvious fact that ordinary people in local community organizations, particularly parents and children working together, these are also areas at a very basic community level that I think need to be addressing, first understanding and then addressing these issues. And from my own experience, I've seen such activities happening at that grassroots and neighborhood level. And it's only going to be through the spread of those kinds of grassroots activities that you're going to get larger scale activity that is questioning and attempting to find alternative ways of doing surveillance in the 21st century.
Okay, so let's end up with having some hope then.
Well, that's...
Thank you, David. It was a real honor to have you. And thank you, everyone, for coming and staying. I know it's late. I know that we have exceeded our time. I hope you have enjoyed it and that you will be thinking about it. And I hope to see you during other events organized by us. Thank you.